everyone watching in, and thank you for joining us for the launch of the States of Fragility 2020 report. My name is Kathleen Forshawn, and I'm a policy analyst here at the OECD, and I will be coordinating today's event. To commence the launch, I'd like to call upon the Secretary General of the OECD, Angel Gurria, to deliver his opening address.
Ladies and gentlemen, it's a pleasure to launch this 2020 edition of the OECD's State of Fragility report. Now, I just want to hold it up because then I get a bonus if we sell enough of these. States of Fragility 2020. Focus on fragility is necessary now more than ever. The COVID-19 pandemic has caused a global health, economic, and social crisis without precedent in living memory. It has also revealed the immense importance of strong states, efficient governments, and solid social security systems to confront the pandemic, to protect the people, to design the recovery strategies. And of course, it has exposed as well the high vulnerability of fragile states in these types of crises. The spread of the coronavirus has aggravated and multiplied issues of fragility across countries and regions. It has contributed to mass unemployment, increased poverty, heightened inequalities, political unrest, rising gender-based violence. These challenges are exacerbating existing tensions. They push some countries ever closer to conflict. They compromise our ambitions to build back better. For countries which are already suffering from violence and conflict, prospects of peace and stability have become more distant. Moreover, the burden of fragility tends to disproportionately fall on those who are already vulnerable and marginalized. For example, States of Fragility identifies 57 countries and territories that currently account for 23% of the world's population and 76% of those living in extreme poverty worldwide. So, take a look at the numbers, please. It's about 23% of the world's population, but it represents 76% of those living in extreme poverty worldwide. So that means this is highly concentrated. What the report also shows is that the factors driving issues of fragility are not static. They're highly complex. They're ever-changing. This is why it's so important to recognize that for many countries and societies experiencing fragility, the root causes often lie beyond their spheres of responsibility and influence. For instance, drivers of conflict frequently emerge from outside the countries most affected. And in addition, those most exposed to the impacts of climate change are often the least responsible for it. Now, States of Fragility 2020 focuses on issues such as inequality, poverty, illness, violence, or injustice. It specifically analyzes how they relate to each other and how they affect people's experiences and the sense of vulnerability. By analyzing fragility, we can help policymakers and those working in fragile contexts to better understand the differences between prosperity and coping, between coping and surviving, and in the most extreme cases, between life and death. If we are to make good on our commitments to leave no one behind, we must acknowledge the realities of complex, interconnected, often deep-rooted issues of fragility. From design to implementation, the report demonstrates that our efforts to mitigate fragility and to build resilience should be inclusive and, of course, accountable. It is crucial to monitor situations closely, to prioritize support for conflict prevention and peace building in these fragile contexts. Now, the report highlights that putting people at the center of our efforts to tackle fragility should not only be a priority, but actually the starting point of it all. We know that fragility undermines our sense of well-being, that people's legitimate aspirations for education are also undermined. Health, community, representation, peace, security, clean, sustainable environments. All these things that many of us take for granted are still elusive for so many. This report emphasizes the importance of prioritizing support for human capital in fragile states. People, particularly for education, where out-of-school rates have been severely exacerbated by the global pandemic. Last but not least, the report underscores that the multiple crises we are facing, because it's not one crisis, there are several crises: the pandemic, climate change, violent conflict, geopolitical instability, are challenging the ambitions of the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development and the Paris Agreement and its goals. 1 year into the decade of action, we have made progress, but we are not on track to deliver on several of the SDGs in fragile contexts, particularly on those related to hunger, health, gender equality, and women's empowerment. We are short in many of these. Only through multilateral cooperation with all stakeholders around the table can we hope to tackle these challenges effectively. As the pandemic has shown, it respects no borders, and the same can be said for fragility. No country can ever hope to tackle these challenges alone. Dear friends, ladies and gentlemen, a world with fragile states is a fragile world. Remember the words of Martin Luther King when he said, quote, "Whatever affects one directly affects all indirectly." We urgently call on governments and their development agencies to continue supporting countries and continue supporting communities in fragile contexts. The OECD will continue to support policymakers and all stakeholders in this important effort. Ultimately, it is the only way to a fair, inclusive, peaceful, sustainable future in a post-COVID-19 world. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Secretary General Guerrilla. I would now like to introduce Her Excellency Minister Aldaziza Magno from the Ministry of Foreign Affairs and Cooperation in Timor-Leste to give her perspective on Timor-Leste's journey from conflict. So there seems to be a bit of technical difficulty, so perhaps we'll come back to Minister Aldaziza Magno. So I would now like to hand you over to Jorge Moreira da Silva, Director of the Development Cooperation Directorate at the OECD.
Thank you. Secretary General, Minister, distinguished guests, I'd like to further provide points on the presentation that the Secretary General gave. The extraordinary events in the last year have pushed fragility to the forefront of our minds as never before. That's why in this report, we identify and tackle those questions. It examines the story of fragility in 2020 as one of two parts. The global states of fragility that existed before COVID-19, but also the dramatic impact that the pandemic is having on that landscape. It also marks the beginning of a new approach to analyzing fragility at OECD. The States of Fragility 2020 report is shorter, sharper, and designed to meet the needs of senior decision makers. The report is supported by 10 working papers and a dedicated online platform packaged to encourage discussions, to inform and shape better policy and program design. The platform allows users to visualize, download, and share data on fragility according to their individual needs. And by the way, I would like to emphasize the fact that many around the world are following this launch at the OECD TV channel. Let me now turn to the key messages to emerge from this body of work. We are seeing clear and urgent trends. 1 year into the decade of action, the furthest behind are falling even further behind. The gaps between people living in the most and least fragile situations are widening. The evidence in this report suggests that fragile contexts have reached a critical juncture for achieving Agenda 2030. As the Secretary General said, in early 2020, before COVID-19, fragile contexts were home to almost a quarter of the world's population and 3/4 of people living in extreme poverty globally. In none of these places were they on track to meet the goals of hunger, health, gender equality. This is not progress. This is leaving many people behind. Layering on the top of climate change and biodiversity loss, COVID-19 is a global systemic shock that is likely to intensify negative trends and compromise even modest progress on the SDGs. Before COVID, 8 fragile contexts were on track to meet SDG 1 on eradicating poverty. But now, early estimates using the most recent projections from the World Bank suggest that the pandemic will result in 26 million additional people in fragile contexts falling into extreme poverty by the end of this year. Just 2 weeks ago, UN Women and UNDP released estimates suggesting that the poverty gap between men and women will widen in the aftermath of COVID-19. In what the UN Women has termed as shadow pandemic of violence against women and girls, the social economic aftermath of COVID-19 are also likely to disproportionately harm women's well-being equality. Taking these trends into account brings me to my second point. Addressing the consequences of COVID-19 means focusing on fragility. COVID-19 may be dominating global headlines, but fragility is the issue that we must address. The consequences of COVID-19 have placed a magnifying glass on the effect that fragility has on everyday lives. For example, the crisis has highlighted the urgent need to support human capital in fragile contexts through investment in health, education, and social protection. Investments that were sorely needed even before the pandemic. The pandemic is also expected to lead to capital flight and reduce external finance. As you know, the OECD has estimated a $700 billion drop on external financing to developing countries, which will in turn affect the tax revenues and pose additional debt risks in fragile contexts. This is where financing, especially from our DAC members, can help. DAC members gave $60.3 billion in ODA to fragile contexts in 2018. Our States of Fragility 2020 has a thematic emphasis on peace in fragile contexts, and this brings me to my third and last point. Preventing conflict and building peace is everyone's responsibility. Violence and armed conflict are concentrated in fragile contexts. In 2019, 65% of the population in fragile contexts were living in situations of active state-based conflict, but given how global systems connect, no one is safe until we are all safe. Drivers of fragility, such as pandemic, affect conflict dynamics and alter the landscape for prevention and peace building. The DAC members have made many high-level commitments to prevent violent conflict and sustaining peace. But of course, we need to do more. Only 4% of ODA to fragile context in 2018 focused on conflict, peace, and security. The Global Agenda for Sustaining Peace is a nationally owned and locally led agenda. To support it, we must build partnerships at every level to support resilient local outcomes. And donors should prioritize prevention always, development when possible, and humanitarian action when necessary in their work. We must also utilize the full potential of the humanitarian development peace nexus, and I'm sure that Susanna Moorhead, the DAC chair, will emphasize this point. The nexus can drive informed analysis, adaptive frameworks, and coherent approaches in fragile context. In this landscape, external security, diplomatic and peace actors have a vital and unique role to play building and sustaining peace. Let me conclude also reflecting on the opening remarks on two important themes that are worth bearing in mind. First, with less than 10 years left on the clock for Agenda 2030, the task before us in addressing fragility has never been greater. But second, as Timor-Leste has shown, and I'm sure that the Minister will make this point, it's important to remember that progress is possible, peace is attainable, and there is always hope. Fragility must remain a focus for DAC members' responses to development and peace. People must be at the center of this effort, and the OECD, as the Secretary General emphasizes, will continue providing data, evidence, and analysis to support these people-centered approaches and to promote just, peaceful, and inclusive societies that leave no one behind. Thank you.
Thank you, George. Perhaps I would now like to call upon Her Excellency Minister Magno once again.
Hello, Kathleen, can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you quite well. Glad to have you.
Hey, so can I start?
Everything is working. I would like to, at the outset, to congratulate the Secretary General of the OECD, Mr. Angel Gurria, for putting together the groundwork that leads the process towards the launching of the State of Fragility Report 2020. It is a privilege for me to represent my country, Timor-Leste, to address this very prestigious event in which, for the first time, Timor-Leste is excluded from the list of fragile states on this report. Certainly, this will constitute a motivating factor for Timor-Leste to move forward and meet its various challenges with more confidence. As you might be aware, that Timor-Leste has just regained its dignity as people and nation 18 years ago, after nearly 500 years under foreign dominations.
first by Portuguese, interrupted for a while by Japanese occupation during Second World War, and then 24 years of Indonesian military occupation that was ended in 1999. Until 1999, the pages of our history had been filled with struggle to regain our freedom through self-determination and independence. Indeed, with all the inconceivable consequences. The 18-year period of independence has marked a very important strike in the process of nation building in Timor-Leste. Although there are a lot of problems that have yet to be resolved, we have made significant progress. We reconstructed our country from ashes. We established the foundation of a democratic state. We healed the wounds of a war by implementing the policy of reconciliation among Timorese, as well as with Indonesia, including normalization of bilateral relations between our two countries. Following the 1999 referendum, before pulling out, Indonesian military destroyed most of the existing infrastructure in Timor-Leste, with practically all the infrastructures destroyed. Timor-Leste confronted with many of the most challenging problems of underdevelopment in the process of its reconstruction. The lack of security and stability, lack of human resources, lack of experiences in running the government, the pressing need to consolidate the democratic institutions, which were still in their fragile stage, the people's high expectation to put to an end their miserable living conditions after gaining independence, and the inherent culture of violence as direct consequence of a prolonged period of military repression had been, collectively, some of the problems that have had great reverberation in Timor-Leste soon after the transfer of power from UNTAED to the government of Timor-Leste in May 20, 2002. The end of the United Nations Transitional Administration in Timor-Leste in May 2002 was the start point of the first steps of the newest born country. The handover of power from the UNTAED to the first democratically elected government of the Democratic Republic of Timor-Leste implies transference of responsibility, transference of the achievements, and above all, transference of a series of remaining unsolved problems. While the UNTAED's mission ended, Timor-Leste continued to enjoy the sympathy and solidarity of the international community. It was under this wave of sympathy and solidarity that Timor-Leste emerged as the youngest nation of the third millennium. The international community has continued to support the development and maintenance of peace, economic cooperation, institutional capacity building, and disclosure of values such as justice and the protection of human rights. Ensuring peace, security, and stability was one of the crucial challenges of the government and the leadership of Timor-Leste. In a Timorese way, our senior leaders were able to think outside the box and had brought some indispensable solutions for the problems during our initial process of state building and nation building. From the very beginning, the Timorese leaders actually have realized that the need to eradicate the culture of violence and to promote reconciliation is imperative to create a favorable condition for peace and harmony among the Timorese themselves and between Timor-Leste and Indonesia as well. It is a sine qua non aspect to ensure a more sustainable development in social, cultural, and economic aspects that promise a solid prospect for the future of the country and its people. So, understanding that the reconstruction of Timor-Leste cannot be based on hatred and revenge, following the restoration of the independence, our senior leaders promoted the policy of reconciliation, harmonization, and normalization with Indonesia so as to forge a new relationship with the closest neighbor as well as to heal the battle scars among our own divided community. Instead of focusing on prosecuting individual perpetrators of violence, as suggested by Serious Crime Unit and some development partners, the leaders of both countries sought for a model of reconciliation that anchored peace building and state building. The establishment of Commission of Truth and Friendship, CTF, by Timor-Leste and Indonesia was a remarkable achievement in terms of reconciliation, normalization, and cooperation between the two countries that were involved in decades of armed conflict. The main task of the CTF was to reveal the truth on issues related to the 1999 event. In addition, the two countries have settled the land border issue peacefully. One of the most common characteristics of new independent countries after a drag on conflict is political instability, and Timor-Leste is not an exception. Despite of international cooperation, the way towards reconstruction and sustainable development was fraught with challenges, as I have mentioned before. Unfortunately, the triumph of democracy is not easy for a country of impoverished population with miserable living conditions and psychologically traumatized. In 2006, a major political crisis occurred and triggered a climate in insecurity in the country. Hundreds of thousands of people internally displaced, and this caused hurt to the new nation. Nevertheless, the leadership proved to be an important element in the creation of a good atmosphere for peace and stability. I must acknowledge the extremely important role of our senior leaders in creating favorable atmosphere for conflict resolution through dialogue and genuine approach conducted by all involved parties, such as civil society, including religious institutions and NGOs, as well as the political parties, the youth, and most of all, our people, in this process for consolidating national unity and stability. These efforts were combined with social justice measures and strong reforms and public investment. We also learned that it is necessary to invest and strengthen our state institutions that at the time were still fragile. Timor-Leste successfully overcame the cycle of conflict. This recovery could not have been achieved without the support and complementary of the United Nations, Portugal, our neighbors Australia and Indonesia, our development partners, and other friendly countries. I would like to reiterate that in confronting numerous challenges, Timorese people always doing their best to successfully navigate away from political storms towards a new period of peace, stability, and economic growth. Because of this success, in celebration of the 10th anniversary of the referendum, the government launched a national motto, Goodbye Conflict, Welcome Development, which the people embrace with all their hearts. In the spirit of solidarity, since 2010, Timor-Leste has strived to give back to the international community and actively engage in sharing experiences and providing support to the small G7 plus group of conflict-affected countries. Through Fragile to Fragile cooperation, we have shared experiences of peace building and reconciliation, elections, resource management in the extractions industry, as well as advocacy on the New Deal implementation. The organization itself advocates for a cooperation based on self-reliance and ownership, country-owned and country-led mechanisms. Ladies and gentlemen, based on our own experience, we firmly believe that development is not possible without peace and stability. In line with this, in 2011, Timor-Leste launched the National Strategic Development Plan, NHDP, 2011-2013, as the people's aspirations and our development prospect for 20 years. The goal is to develop a prosperous and strong upper middle income country by 2030 and gradually step towards sustainable development. The development vision has been fully harmonized with Timor-Leste Constitution as well as the Sustainable Development Goals 2030 agenda. Timor-Leste appreciates the OECD assessment on states of fragility 2020, in which for the first time Timor-Leste is not categorized in a fragile context. Over the last 18 years since our independence, we have achieved substantial progress maintaining peace and solid stability based on democratic values and human rights as the necessary condition for economic, social, political, and cultural development, which in turn will reinforce and consolidate peace, stability, and the functioning of democratic institutions. Additionally, Timor-Leste also has made important progress in health, education, women's representation in the national parliament, and decision-making process related to peace and security, and champion the 23 Agenda SDG 16. In the last 3 years, Timor-Leste had presidential and 2 rounds of parliamentary election conducted peacefully. These were the first elections held since the UN peacekeeping mission ended in Timor-Leste. This demonstrates the resilience and values the Timorese nation attach to peace and democracy. Another major milestone that Timor-Leste conquered on its sovereignty was the conclusion of our maritime boundary with Australia through the compulsory conciliation under Annex 5 of the UNCLOS in 2018. However, challenges remain. The statistical database from several national and international organizations shown that Timor-Leste's economic situation in 2019 and for 2020 have been slowed down due to the slow pace of non-oil economic diversification, shortage of domestic revenue mobilization, lack of institutional and absorptive capacity, and the environmental sustainability and resilience. Similar to other countries, the COVID-19 pandemic lockdowns inevitably influenced Timor-Leste's economy as the oil price in the global market flows to zero. As an oil-reliant country, Timor-Leste has lost almost 1.8 billion, approximately 60% in the worldwide market. Moreover, it has also produced negative social impacts by disrupting supply chains, increase unemployment, reduce incomes, and threaten economic activity. This could conceivably push our most vulnerable citizens into poverty and food deficit. As also highlighted in the State of Fragility 2020 report, it is concerned that the COVID-19 will continue to dramatically exacerbate economic, social, and political hardships and threaten peace and stability, particularly for countries that are already in fragile situation. In this regard, I would like to encourage all to continue the collective action of the shared responsibility cooperation under multilateralism platform based on the spirit of solidarity, inclusiveness, and most importantly, joint effort and renewed political commitment. We all have to ensure a peaceful and secure world by addressing causes of fragility and drivers of conflict and building resilience to achieve the 2030 agenda and ensure that no one is left behind. Let me conclude by congratulating the OECD for their achievements and may continue shaping policies that foster prosperity, equality, opportunity, and well-being for all. Thank you.
Thank you, Minister Magno. I'd now like to hand you over to our moderator for the panel discussion, Azra Zaya, the President and CEO of the Alliance for Peace Building. Thank you.
Thank you, Karen, and congratulations to you and all your colleagues on an incredibly comprehensive and compelling report. We've just heard from the Secretary General about how COVID-19 has been a force multiplier for fragility, from Director Moreira da Silva about how fragile contexts are falling further behind, and from Foreign Minister Magno about one nation, Timor-Leste's inspirational and challenging journey from fragility to resilience. It's my pleasure now to expand the conversation to include leading voices from donor governments, intergovernmental organizations, and civil society. We have with us Susanna Moorhead, the chair of the OECD Development Assistance Committee, Helder da Costa, General Secretary of G7+, Ambassador Liberata Rutagaruka Mulamula, visiting scholar and associate director of the Institute for African Studies at George Washington University Elliott School, and Elke Lobel, Deputy Director General for Displacement, Migration, Crisis Prevention and Management at the German Ministry for Economic Cooperation and Development. You can all read their impressive bios online, and I want to thank all four of you for joining us today. Before we turn to our distinguished panelists, allow me to offer a few comments at the outset. I represent a leading global alliance of peacebuilding organizations that embodies the development humanitarian peace nexus. Our membership includes development and humanitarian organizations alongside private sector and grassroots non-governmental actors working on the front lines to end violent conflict and sustain peace in over 180 countries. From my perspective, OECD's 2020 report validates three critical points. First, the imperative for centering fragility in both COVID-19 response and recovery and Agenda 2030 efforts. Second, the long-term and non-linear nature of the path to resilience and the corollary need for sustained, flexible assistance for fragile contexts. And finally, the conclusion that the case for conflict prevention has never been stronger. According to the Institute for Economics and Peace, violent conflict cost the world $14.5 trillion in 2019. of which nearly 3/4 went towards military and internal security spending. With the report telling us how violent conflict is concentrated in fragile contexts, 79% of deaths from violent conflict and 96% of deaths from state-based armed conflict occurring in these fragile contexts, an integrated approach to prevention that aligns diplomacy, development, and security assistance is essential. With these initial thoughts in mind, I'd like to turn to the brain trust before us. We'll proceed with an initial question to each of our distinguished speakers, which represent questions that were submitted by our global online audience. I'd like to start with Susanna Moorhead. Susanna, from the perspective of DAC members, what are the main messages to take from this report?
Well, Uzra, thank you very much, and particularly for mentioning the nexus, which of course is central to all our deliberations. I mean, I think it's hard to imagine a moment in our recent history when the States of Fragility report has been more important or more timely. The numbers are terrifying, and I think we have to wake up to the fact that we're not just off track on the Sustainable Development Goals, we are in reverse. We know that fragility makes poverty worse and that poverty reduction is much harder in fragile contexts. It's a toxic cocktail. You add COVID into the mix and it puts that toxicity on steroids. I don't think I need to repeat what the Secretary General and others have said. I think we've heard the messages. If I may, I would like to focus on what the DAC should do about this. And it's three things. The first is we have to mobilize political momentum. I mean, that's politicians and people. I'm constantly struck by the lack of global coming together behind the current crisis for poor countries. You know, where is the Live Aid? Where's the Make Poverty History campaign? Where's the End of Debt campaign? Where's the G20 that we had in the global financial crisis? Where is the Paris Agreement to tackle climate? Now, we kind of know why. We're all focused on the crisis at home. And we are using the nexus in addressing that crisis domestically. But the first thing we have to do is to look to the nature of what this will do for all of us, not just the poor, and to try and reset the political discourse on this. So rich countries actually have adopted a nexus approach. We have invested in the immediate health crisis, but simultaneously intervened on the development side, if you like, to protect jobs, to protect the economy, to support the institutions, and even in some cases have intervened to ensure that the rule of law and order are maintained despite social tensions. So guess what? The nexus works. It's not perfect, but if we innovate, if we take risks, trial and error, course correct when we get it wrong, it is clear that we are in a better place with this pandemic in rich countries than we were 6 months ago. It also works in developing countries, and I would really highlight, and it's very interesting to hear what the Minister of Timor-Leste said, that other examples in the report. You know, there are some good news stories, and it's really easy to get sort of just depressed and say we can't do anything, and it becomes a sort of counsel of despair. So I urge you to read what works in the report, and at the heart of that is this triple nexus, which of course was conceived of in the DAC and is one of our few legislative instruments. And the third and final thing we need to do is to mobilize resources for fragility. Fragile states need ODA more than anyone else. They find it hardest to get foreign investment or domestic resource revenues or other sources of finance. But I have to be honest with you, official development assistance is under enormous pressure, and it is certain that demand will outstrip supply. You only have to think about the humanitarian burden that the world is facing, and it is DAC donors who will pick up a very substantial part of the costs of that over the course of the next year or so. But fragility, we know, is expensive. I mean, Uzra, you cited some figures. You know, if you don't invest in stability, it costs you more. And I think we've actually learned that from the massive borrowing that we have done in our own countries. We also need to spend the odor that we have wisely and to make it go further. And there's some pretty practical things here. There should be less competition between agencies, more collaboration, single plans, make sure everybody's pulling in the right direction. We need to design programs that build resilience in from the beginning, and that includes resilience to climate change, because that is just further toxifying this mixture. And we need to invest in peace building and conflict prevention. At the moment, it's only about 4% of official development assistance that goes into this. But this is a good investment that brings enormous returns, and even more so if you hardwire women into that process. So 3 things: political mobilization, focus on what works, and spend the resources we have to invest in stability and prosperity. Thank you.
Thank you, Susanna, and thank you for making such critical points in such a cogent fashion. I'd like to turn now to Helder da Costa. And Helder, I'd like to share a question that the report points to the rising pressure on fragile and conflict-affected contexts, the global systemic shocks of COVID-19, climate change disruptions that Susanna mentioned, and economic crises. From the perspective of the G7+, does this alter the narrative for you on approaches to conflict prevention?
Thank you, Azra. First of all, thank you for inviting the G7+ to the launch of the States of Fragility 2020, which is very timely amid the challenging time the world is dealing with. All protocols observers, just want to express my greetings to Excellency Secretary General and all fellow panelists, including Excellency Minister, Madam Minister of Foreign Affairs, and from Timor-Leste, and also the Vice Minister of Foreign Affairs from Timor-Leste, which is still there. It is an honor and privilege for me to join this panel. Let me quickly introduce, Uzra, in a nutshell, what the G7+ is all about before answering your question from the G7+ perspective. As Madam Minister eloquently alluded to earlier on, the G7+ was established in Dili, Timor-Leste, during the first international dialogue on peace building and state building, at a time where critical peace building and state building was the cornerstone of the discussion. It brought together 20 countries around the world affected by conflict and fragility, ranging from Africa, the Asia, Pacific, and the Caribbean, motivated by a shared vision of achieving peace and stability. It is a platform for member states to advocate for change to international engagement, the very issue that we discussed today, in conflict-affected situations, share experiences, and support each other, including the fragile to fragile cooperation. And yet the G7+ has just recently obtained its UN observer status by the United Nations General Assembly in December 2019. As you know, I just wanted to say congratulations to the OECD for releasing such a timely report. We echoed all the findings there. It is a vivid story for the G7+ countries. As you know, countries affected by conflict and fragility disproportionately concentrate on the world's development challenges. The lack of peace and weak institutions to sustain social and development gains has been a common challenge for us. Clearly, peace building, as Suzanne mentioned on, and state building are key preconditions along all development dimensions of development. As mentioned in the report, there are 57 contexts that are ranked to be more fragile, including 13 classified as being extremely fragile. And out of these 13 extremely fragile, 9 of them are members of G7+ countries. So the stake is very high here. But the good thing is that one of our member states, Togo, has been added to the list of 57, and Timor-Leste has been removed. Credit to Timor-Leste's key milestone. Congratulations, Madam Minister and the government of Timor-Leste. Let me now turn to COVID-19 pandemic to answer your question, Azra. It is global in nature and it has affected all of us. At the outset, I'd like to remind that regardless how resilient or fragile each country is to the effect of pandemic, COVID-19 can only be defeated through collectivism, mutual cooperation, and solidarity. As Francis Fukuyama, a US scholar, recently said, the factors responsible for successful pandemic responses have been three elements: state capacity, social trust, and leadership. Countries with all three: a competent state apparatus, a government that citizens trust and listen to, and effective leaders have performed impressively, limiting the damage they have suffered. While countries with dysfunctional states, polarized societies, or poor leadership have done badly, leaving their citizens and economies exposed and vulnerable. This is true and the very lesson of the outbreak of COVID-19 that teaches us. Now, to answer your question, the outbreak of COVID-19 and its associated economic and social risks, it only manifested the narrative of G7+ on conflict prevention. Let me highlight two important points that define our narratives. One, ending active conflicts and wars is and should be the #1 priority. Ongoing conflicts and crises have been the fundamental factors for fragility and extreme poverty, as the report has indicated. National dialogue and reconciliation is the most affordable means to stop wars and make peace, as eloquently elaborated by Madam Minister of Foreign Affairs from Timor-Leste. The grievances that cause and remain a risk for future conflicts can be addressed through reconciliation that is founded on the national context, national means, and culture. We have examples around the world that offer evidence to prove this right. Needless to mention, my own country, Timor-Leste, and Rwanda, which have been recognized in the report as vivid stories that should inspire the world. Number two, conflict prevention cannot and should not be summed up as a compilation of ad hoc projects and activities founded and fragmented in analysis and theories. Pursuing stability that rests on capable state, functioning institutions, and vibrant economy should be our end state. For these G7+ countries, we did not need a pandemic to learn this hard lesson. Our member countries have been living such a reality for decades now. The framework for New Deal that we agreed upon in Busan in 2011 under the auspices of the OECD is really an imperative. And I hope that our partners, in particular, the DAC members, remember those principles, the 5 peace building and state building goals, which include inclusive politics, security, justice, economic foundations, and service delivery, were the preconditions for progress and on peace and stability. So to sum up in this first question, the pandemic of COVID-19 has reinforced the collective perspective of the G7+ group on pursuing peace and stability. It is against this background that the G7+ recently issued a statement in May this year and submitted to the United Nations Secretary General, to the World Bank, and to all other international institutions, calling for a global ceasefire, a case for investment in public health and strengthening institutions, a call to care for displaced people stranded due to border closures, and a call for support to the economic recovery, including debt relief and sustaining peace agenda. I thank you for the time being.
Thank you so much, Helder, and thank you for reminding us how the current context has really reinforced and validated the G7+ perspective. With that, I would like to turn now to Elke Lobo and pose a question from our global audience. How does a report like this help to shape policy implementation across the Nexus?
Thank you so much, first of all, for this invitation. And I'm more than happy to participate in this important discussion on the current state of fragility in a time when COVID-19 is changing our world. It's hard to overestimate, having said that, the importance of the report, for the international community and donor community, because the report helps practitioners to better understand the context of fragility we are engaged with. It translates a very solid empirical data analysis into clear-cut policy recommendations. It serves as a guidance for decision makers to improve policies and approaches accordingly. And so the analysis once more underlines fragility hinders inclusive and sustainable development and the achievement of the SDGs. Fragility is a key driver of violent conflict, displacement, and you read, I'm the Commissioner for Refugee Policy in my ministry, poverty and hunger. So I think I really love the report, and having said that, I will tell you, I love the way you do your reporting also in graphs. I hope you can see what I'm showing you over here. These very good documentation and summaries of your reports, I think is very important, because what I do is like advertisement and propaganda to all directions. Look into this report. It's a long report, but you can get summaries. So we learned from the report a lot. We learned that the ongoing COVID-19 pandemic worsens fragility trends. The report underlines, if we want to respond effectively to the impact of COVID-19 and the challenges such as climate change, inequality, and polarizing politics, we have to respond more effectively to fragility. But it has, I think, 180 pages. So for me, the most important question is, how can we get through with the report and its finding to those who shape policies in its different dimensions, and how can we better put the findings into action and practice? And Mrs. Moorhead, thank you very much. You said, how can we mobilize political momentum? So I like the report very much. I like also the way you communicate it, but it's a long way to go. But from the side of a donor and an implementation institution, a ministry, I think we have to work on that. INCAP is in this sense a crucial platform to inform, to achieve policy commitments, which is important. We don't need only the information, we need the commitment. You also mentioned that. To share good practices and to reach policy shapers, so that they do not only argue on the national level, as you mentioned in your interventions before. Finally, from my point of view as a very practitioner person, it's all about delivering better results in contexts affected in fragility. And this is why we, as INCAP co-chair, remain committed to further improve the effectiveness and approaches in fragile situations, to make us all even more fit for fragility. Because I say this very open, to continue to have a continued support of our taxpayers and our parliament, we need exactly that. So thank you very much for the report, for the way of presentation. And what I would like to stress now, come a little bit to the practical side of the report, and give you just some examples and thoughts from my point of view with reference to German development cooperation along the 4 key recommendations of the report. I think it's very good that you formulated 4 key recommendations. Starting with the strategic planning, make long-term goals stick, adapt to short-term while sticking to long-term strategy. I, as a development worker for many years, can tell you this is my favorite one, because it shows that we have to continue to increase funding of projects in fragile contexts with a lot of flexibility, with instruments that connect short-term and long-term, and which bridge a gap which still is existing. I don't want to call it always nexus, because we start to talk the whole time about nexus, but we have to implement it, we have to live it. So this is something I think you worked out quite well. The goal to have a feasible and context-oriented application of development cooperation and humanitarian aid is important for me, and this is the way to go. to be better in this on this way. I would like to give you an example. We have one instrument which is the Transitional Development Assistance, which intends to strengthen resilience of individuals and institutions. So this is the bridge I was talking about. And we, for example, invested a total budget of 1.4 billion euro in this instrument. So this is quite an investment. It can be used fast and flexible, but at the same time allows for a 5-year planning horizon. So we are working on that. How can we be more fit in fragile context? And we will show you a little video at the end of my presentation where we present, for example, a hospital in Iraq, in Mosul, and I personally have been there in 2018, and the hospital is already built in the place. It was not only a short-term intervention, it was directly connected to an infrastructure that is helping in Mosul. We have another example. I just want to put these pictures in your mind, because this is important if I talk to policy shapers that they have these pictures. Another example is a solar panel in Satari camp in Jordan, which right after the creation of the camp, we connected a big solar panel to the community at the site of the camp. And so we had energy for both, for host community and the refugees. And this, for example, was presented at the Global Refugee Forum. And it was like a starting point of rethinking what are we doing with humanitarian aid and development, and how can we connect this better. Additional, we have improved in strategic planning between different ministries in Germany. We elaborated a concept for joint analysis and strategic planning with the Foreign Office. So this is all your first point, not only short-term, also work on long-term. What I like very much is also your organizational process makes the system work smarter. This is important, and we can do that. We have launched a BMZ Reform 2030 strategy, and one crucial part of it is the launch of a new category of partnership, the Nexus and Peace Partners. We have a new category which we apply for long-lasting or recurrent crisis and conflict contexts, fragility and forced displacement context. Why has this been an important step? This is again coming from practice to policy shaping, because with the new Nexus and Peace Partners, we can strategically focus and contribute to stability and reconstruction. And we created also political visibility for our work in fragile context, because everybody understands, oh, BMZ is having a new category. What is going on there? We reach the decision makers with this way of communicating. I think this is important, and with this Nexus and Peace Partners, we use all instruments available in the ministry. We have a great flexibility, and we can strengthen potentials for peace by tackling root causes of conflicts and displacement, reducing fragility by using all these instruments. Coming to the third point, country level engagement, identify and invest in partners. I think this is a way we have to go, and we are already on, but still a lot to do. Our Nexus and Peace Partners will strategically oriented expand their partnerships with UN agencies and international NGOs. For example, Gambella in Ethiopia, again, a picture for your mind. We brought together UNICEF and UNHCR with NGOs to invest in water supply for refugees. 1 cubic meter of water cost $9 before we started. Afterwards, connecting with pipelines to the community nearby, we reduced the cost of water trucks to $1 per cubic meter. So the partnership was seen at the local level, and it is a real successful project which supports refugees and hosting communities. It's called Regional Open Program for Sustainable Water and Sanitation Services for Refugees, IDPs, and host communities, and implemented also by KfW. So we brought together different actors who know a lot, and we had a win-win situation. So the objective is of the program is to support the transition from a care and maintenance situation to an integrated supply model. Also, this program was presented at the Global Refugee Forum as an example of good practice. And what we do now is we have a feasibility study that is being elaborated, and we want to expand it to the whole Horn of Africa. Another point, global framework, take a fresh look at the dialogue. Invest in collaboration and interoperability. I like this very much. Convincing partner to jointly operate in difficult fragility contexts. We do this with UNICEF and World Food Programme. We now have running projects of 227 million where both institutions work together. So we propose, for example, a water program like in Ethiopia, and we ask them as a donor to work together. I think this is quite a good idea. And on this point, I would also mention that we have to come out of this situation that policy shapers often think that a fragility situation is something stuck. It's the same for 1 year, for 2 years, but it's very diverse and it changes. So there we also have to change their mindset that this is something which is underlying great changes in short periods. And I think that this is another important point. To conclude, I'm sorry for being too long perhaps, but you see, I want to connect the concept and the report to my practical experience, and I hope that we are going to convince the Parliament also in 2020 to support us in our work with fragile countries. And I think these examples will make it possible for me to talk to them and make them support us also in the future. Then we are learning from evidence, and we are getting deeper into implementation. I think this is the next step we have to take. We would like to highlight in a short video our peace approach, infrastructure for peace approach, which I did not talk too much about right now, but I think the video is very interesting and demonstrates the cooperation and the implementation of the HDP nexus. I think if we do it together, we can do it in a much better way. And just to give you a last point, which is important for me, where do we come from? I would like to refer on the Syria conference in 2014, in Berlin, when we first had all donors together to react on the Syria crisis. One of the main points was that in the document, it was written that we give multi-year funding into the Syria crisis. This is 6 years ago, and this was something new. Imagine today, nobody is questioning that in fragile contexts and in crisis and displacement, we need a multi-year funding. So, having said that, thank you very much for the report. We can make a difference. We have to implement, we have to go deeper now from the concept, learning by what we are doing. And I hope you like the Iraq video, which gives you some more information about this. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Elke. I think we will cue the video now. Thank you so much.
Nineveh, northern central Iraq. The governorate is marked by ethnical and religious diversity. There have been numerous conflicts in the region for a long time. During the occupation by the so-called Islamic State, millions of people have lost their livelihoods as they were forced to flee their homes. After the liberation, many of them are now moving back to their hometowns and villages. Upon their return, the people are confronted with destroyed infrastructure, missing job opportunities, and lacking access to education and health services.
Das Bundesentwicklungsministerium unterstützt die Bevölkerung in Ninive. Wir wollen im Rahmen der Übergangshilfe insbesondere die Resilienz, also die Widerstandsfähigkeit der betroffenen Menschen lokal vor Ort stärken. Ganz wichtig ist es dabei, physischen Wiederaufbau und gesellschaftlichen Wiederaufbau zu verbinden. So haben wir zum Beispiel ein Wiederaufbauprojekt, wo wir den Wiederaufbau einer Schule mit Friedenserziehung verbinden. Ganz wichtige Partner sind dabei natürlich UN-Organisationen, es ist die Gesellschaft für internationale Zusammenarbeit, es sind Nichtregierungsorganisationen und lokale Partner.
To build new trust within the communities, GIZ and the international NGO Untitled have established conflict prevention teams. The peace workers offer mediation, negotiation and violence prevention to the local population.
بصفتنا كناشطين في مجال السلام وبناء السلام نعمل في مختلف محافظة نينوى في الأغذية والنواحي والقرى والأرياف وفي مركز الموصل بالتحديد. عملنا حقيقة على النشاطات والفعاليات اللي تجمع المكونات بمختلف أنواعها سواء دينيا أو عرقيا أو قوميا.
Open spaces for young people shall help to start the process of reconciliation among and within families for a peaceful coexistence.
Wir sehen in der Praxis, dass Friedensprozesse häufig von Männern dominiert werden. Uns ist es aber ganz, ganz wichtig, dass auch die Anliegen von Frauen, dass die Perspektiven von Jugendlichen mehr mit einbezogen werden. Genau das sehen wir als unsere Aufgabe an.
Thank you again, Elke, for sharing the video and for really stressing that the system can work smarter and showing the practical application of so much of what is illustrated in the report. It's just wonderful to see the human example. Thank you. With that, I think we will turn to our next distinguished panelist, Ambassador Liberata Mulamula. And Liberata, I'd like to pose a question from your perspective. What are the practical things that matter the most for states dealing with fragility?
Hello everyone. I'm in Tanzania, so this is evening. I believe you are still afternoon. I don't know what time it is there, but let me start again by thanking OECD and especially Jonathan for coordinating this important meeting. And of course, I wanted to congratulate OECD for the wonderful report. And as my colleague Elke from BMZ has said, it's one of the few reports that I could read from cover to cover. But in my previous capacity, I was in the Great Lakes region, the International Conference on the Great Lakes region as executive secretary. So I used to go to the OECD every time to be able to get their reports, to be able to get access to their policy relevant data and the analysis, which were really critically needed in addressing and strengthening. Now we are talking it as a nexus between humanitarian development, peace, and peace. In the introduction, I have three hats because I'm with the George Washington University, but I am here in the context of a member of the eminent persons, independent eminent persons of the Secretary General for the Peace Building Architecture Review. I'm also a member of the UN Secretary General Advisory Group on Peace Building Fund. So what I've been listening and hearing from since we started and from the report is quite an important conversation that as eminent persons we really needed. And the mandate of the eminent persons started with following the adoption of the resolution, a twin resolution by the General Assembly and the Security Council in 2016. This was the first time that you have these two important organs addressing the need for building a common division of society, ensuring that the needs of all segments of the population are taken into account. Of course, when I read your report and hearing also from Susan, the nexus in your context starts with the humanitarian development and peace. But in our context, we start with the peace, development, and humanitarian, considering that every time when there is either implementation of projects, the peace is always a missing piece. So I said maybe to change the mindset, they start with the peace nexus. But, these are the issues, and especially the nexus that is being mentioned throughout the report, that as eminent persons is what we looked at mostly. And of course, we have submitted our report to the Secretary General. We see how it advises the final decisions of these two organs. Now, speaking from the practitioner's point of view, as I said, I come from Tanzania, and I'm currently based in Tanzania, but I worked into through the peace processes in the region. So when you speak of fragility, it is generally misunderstood, or it is understood as bearing a negative connotation or a negative image that we always relate fragility with, of course, post-conflict countries, with failed states. So if you allow me just to share with you my experience when I was in Burundi, leading this organization of the Great Lakes region. I remember this was the period between 2006 to 2012. So when I started, Burundi was emerging from the conflict. But then, as they also the report points out, you find that most of the ODA and from Moscow, of course, those other international financial institutions, the financial flows, the big chunk goes to the fragile states. And if I heard correctly from the director of the Cooperation Directorate, that $3 billion, they go into fragile context. So Burundi, by then, really like enjoyed this status because it was attracting a lot of money to Burundi. But then when they joined the East African community, in that, the narrative, the priorities were like focusing on attracting trade flows, attracting foreign direct investments. And that's when Burundi says, started appealing that they should be removed from the fragile context because that was impeding the direct investments, was impeding trade flow, because you see all the criteria that you have been talking about, how you define a fragile state. It was not conducive or building confidence and trust for the investors, because how do you invest in such a country which everything is not working? Everything is in the negative. But then they also, of course, Burundi, even now, they are fighting to see that they are removed from the agenda of the UN Security Council, because it's like stigmatizes you to be called a fragile state. So I want to share with you that this is how fragility sometimes is interpreted to mean, but also countries wanted to come out of this situation or status. So from the report, let me say that one, I appreciate the fact that countries that are seen as fragile is not a permanent phenomenon, because we have seen countries from the report that have graduated. There's Timor, Timor-Leste, Bingwan, Rwanda, of course, in our neighborhood, and Egypt and others. But also, I see from the report that it has brought out a fundamental issue that of a fragile world, and recognizing that fragility is a global problem that affects gravely those, of course, who cannot cope with it. But it has also shown that it is not, because again, these countries I'm talking about, they are like always the usual suspects. When you talk of fragility, it's Somalia, DRC, it is Burundi. But then I was looking at that chart. There are so many countries that are in the fragile state. So this is one of my takeaway. But also the report shows, and this is what has been lacking in most of the analysis in terms of fragile states, because they are all condemned like, but we have seen that it is multidimensional. There are issues that these countries are strong in terms of maybe resilience, for example. We have seen I am in Tanzania now. Of course, everyone can say whatever they see as happening. But since I arrived, it's 1 month. I've not had any cases of COVID. It's not that it is not reported. I've not had any case of death as it was previously in the 2 months or 3 months ago. So the question is, how did we get over this? It is the issue of resilience. Resilience, how we be able to cope through, of course, traditional, through herbal medicine. I mean, there are a number of factors. So, but you see that those countries, for example, that have come out from fragility, you find that they are strong in certain areas, but they still have issues with regard to political security issues. So you cannot have a blanket cover that defines these countries. So this is one element which I want also to emphasize. But also the state of fragility underlines what the UN peacebuilding architecture review process seeks to achieve. Namely, of course, putting people at the center of the peace-building efforts, and what they report is almost 3/4 about people-centered. But when we talk of people-centered, at the expense of getting into the populist language of maybe politicians, what do we mean? And this is what the eminent persons were trying to unravel and show that when we talk of people-centered, we are not getting into the populist game where you make general statements, but you are not showing what impact, like we have heard from what the BMZ they have been doing. I mean, the impact, even with a small amount of money, you can see the impact immediately when it is put in the right place, but also involving the local communities and local populations. So this is where I think also the report has spoken well, but then we should also avoid having these people-centered and without showing exactly what does that mean to an ordinary person who is in this fragile context. But also, one of the things that came out of COVID, they say every crisis, there's an opportunity, but also there is a silver lining. Dear colleagues, it is evident that prevention works. It has been shown from all the interventions that have been done are mostly in preventive measures. And the investment is going to preventive measures, whether it is for the first responders having protective gears, but also influencing the people's behavior. It is a lot one. So I think if there's anything we can learn from this COVID crisis, it is to emphasize that prevention really works, and therefore we need to put where our mouth is. We have seen it working. So in summary, let me say, of course, I was also happy to hear from Director Moderator that addressing fragility is vital for peace. As I started at the beginning, that it is always a missing link. That when you see fragility in terms of development assistance, but you don't link it with the peace building, this is where we have every time lapses, because the grievances are not addressed. The disagreement, the violence, or the root causes of the violence are not addressed. So taking from this report, I think, I don't know who are the takers, because as I said, I used to make trips to The Hague and to get these reports. You don't get them easily, but nowadays, of course, with the social media, it might be easier to reach those who really need these reports, the decision makers, the policy makers. It has to inform the policy. And of course, there is also a recognition there's no one size fits all options in a fragile context. And this is what I was trying to explain, that you cannot say that what has worked in Timor-Leste would work for Burundi, for example. So this is, I think that's what the report also trying to show, how different approaches, different interventions, depending on the circumstances and local situations. So in short, let me summarize of what my take is. One, that fragility is not a permanent phenomenon, and I dare say it's a man-made. We can do away with it if we have correct interventions and policies. And two, tackling fragility requires a comprehensive and holistic approach, as stated in this report, because it says an approach based on local needs, priorities, and resilience. This is what I really want to emphasize, especially in tackling fragility in the part of our world. 3, it requires inclusivity, involving all actors, especially the local actors. I want to emphasize the local actors and ensuring, of course, local ownership. Because if there's no local ownership, when you have money, of course, a lot of money is being spent in these countries, but then it's for short term. And then we send experts, consultants, when they leave, then that's sometimes when everything collapses. So investing in local capacity and ownership, I think, is what I found was a big highlight, but also highlighting and emphasizing ensuring no one is left behind. Of course, this is a motto we use in the women, in pursuing the women and peace security agenda. No one is left behind. I'm glad that this has been underlined in this report, not only for women, but for everyone. So this is one I think I appreciate from this report. And finally, for you, of course, as an academician, I want to end on that we need what I found in the report, and this is what I should advise us, the 3 C's. Throughout the report, the complementarity, the coherence, and collaboration. Of course, this together forms also partnerships. So I thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Ambassador, I think for making such critical points on investing in local ownership, the fact that prevention works, the stigmatization of fragility at the outset, where I can say, beaming into you from the United States, I think we can all have a great deal of humility about the degree to which every country has factors of fragility and a fragile balance between that and resilience. So with that, I would like to open a second round of questions to our panelists, starting again with Susanna, building off your compelling opening. You mentioned the need to really generate political momentum. And we've seen that in the United States with bipartisan support for new legislation, the Global Fragility Act. I'd like to ask, do you have any advice on how to best create that global political momentum that we need to address fragility?
Oh, okay, tricky follow-up question. I mean, look, I think I should say that this event, this report, the tweeting that's going on, I mean, that is a really, really good starting point. And because it has such a good reputation, then it does land. I think the difficulty is we're kind of preaching to the converted, if you like. So I think the real challenge is how do we get this, I mean, this urgency, but also this optimism to a wider audience. And look, I mean, I may be wrong, and I'm not a psychologist, but it seems to me that taxpayers, young people, those who are fortunate enough not to live in fragile states, nevertheless have learned more about fragility in their own lives during this pandemic than they probably have done for many, many years. I mean, particularly for people, who are under 70. Now there is I think regrettably a sense in some quarters that means you need to double down, you need to think about yourself, you need to look inwards, you need to protect what you have. But I think I am an optimist and I believe in the human spirit. I think there are many people who actually are rethinking their role in the world, the importance of society, the threat of climate. I mean, we only need to look at some of the mass demonstrations there have been. So I think there is a growing recognition and understanding that fragility affects us all, and that actually whether we think about this pandemic or the climate crisis, we are not going to be safe ourselves unless we have a global response. There's a strong message, following on immediately from what Liberator said, that, prevention works, but, it saves money as well as lives. So prevention is a good investment. And I think to just remind ourselves that we can make a difference. So we have the real expertise, and I would just like to thank both Germany and the United Kingdom for co-chairing the Conflict and Fragility Network, INCAF, so professionally. And there is, deep expertise, as we heard, on what this looks and feels like in fragile contexts. But we need to use everyone, the networks we have, the institutions. So, talk to the press, get this in the paper, get this on television, use social media. As the report points out, I think we have tended to underestimate how important diplomats are. We tend to think about humanitarian workers, development professionals, defense professionals. This is what diplomats do. Diplomats move between these different, often warring factions. They make deals, they build peace, they make progress. So they are key. Civil society is key. My plea to civil society would be part of the solution, be more positive, recognize the pressure that many donors are under, talk to citizens in a way that is going to encourage them to do more. And talk to the skeptics. Don't just talk to your fan base, talk to the people who disagree with you. I think we need to galvanize our multilateral institutions and to remind ourselves that multilateralism does work. We need the UN agencies working more closely together. We need the international financial institutions continuing to lean in to these fragile contexts. The regional development banks, the development finance institutions, everybody focusing on this problem and seeing what each can do, because there is a division of labor there. But if we coordinate it, it can be greater than the sum of its parts. So no easy answers, but I ask myself, if we are not going to do this now, then when? And I think if we leave it too long, as I said in my previous intervention, we are falling backwards as a world, and we need to stop that. Thank you.
Thank you, Susanna. I think for a just absolutely compelling roadmap on the way forward. With that, I would like to turn again to Helder. And Helder, we talked about the validation of G7 plus efforts that's really manifested in this report. And the report places such a strong emphasis of partnership on different dimensions. Susanna mentioned some of the critical actors, diplomats, civil society, multilateral institutions who have to come forward. Is there one suggestion on partnership that stands out for you?
Thank you again, Azra. I listened to my fellow panelists and also extracting the recommendations of the report. I found the terms and contents are very familiar to the G7+. In fact, I was excited to read how the report was featured the voice of G7+, as if we are writing it. That's one. Secondly, we have heard about the concept of the 3 Ds, defense, diplomacy, development. We also heard the concept of the 3 Cs, the complementarity, coherence, and collaboration. And also the partnership, and also the report nicely puts out it's a time for us to have reactivate or galvanize the dialogue between the North and the South. There is a mistrust, in our humble opinion, to see this kind of dialogue between the North and the South. That's why the Southern countries are busy doing this themselves, the South-South cooperation and triangular cooperation and so on. But what stands out for me here is that if I I'm not mistaken, I read the report here somewhere that the fragility is like a small ship in the middle of the ocean. If we don't look after the ship will go down and sink. Yeah. So which means that the person who navigates the ship has to be smarter, has to be brave, and has to be visionary, looking beyond the horizon. So this brings to my point that what is missing here has to be the bigger picture should always come first when we talk about the fragile states. Again, back to the New Deal that I was talking about, you put in the right ownership, the leadership to the countries themselves to carry this forward, to set the agenda. Whereas the partnership with all those concepts we discussed about, we are simply going there and adding this kind of complementarity and helping and strengthen the country themselves to be resilient so that they can move out from fragility towards resilience. And the last point I would like to say that the pathway to stability and resilience is a long process and often bumpy. So be prepared that we might as well graduate, but suddenly we can regress again in the years to come. You know? So there is no guarantee, as the report eloquently said. Yeah. So this is like a non-linear process. But for me, what I found is that this would mean that ad hoc, time-bound, fragmented activity should be replaced with strategic thinking, long-term and well-coordinated in partnership for peace and stability. So from the little G7 Plus perspective, the final point I want to say is that we are ready to work with you. We are there to be of help, to assistance if you need us, because we know we also, from the work that we have done over the past 10 years, we know for sure what are the challenges and what are the complications, so that we appeal to you, let's work together in this new partnership for the better of the people on the ground. Thank you.
Thank you, Helder. And thank you for emphasizing just your readiness to work and the answers that we've had for some time, that I think we've got a new dynamic and a new alignment globally to meaningfully move forward. I'd like to hear now again from Ambassador Liberata Mulamula. And, we were happy to hear about your very important role in the peacebuilding architecture review. And I'd like to ask, how does this report speak to that experience, and how do you see these components coming together?
Yeah, thank you again. As I started in answering the first question, it was trying to put the report in the context of the work. It's ongoing work of trying to establish this a nexus between peace development and humanitarian, but also looking at the unbundling it and looking at some of the key dimensions, which I find in the report. Because when you talk of these three nexus, these three components, it's very difficult for an ordinary person to really understand what you're talking about. So what I find in the report is unbundling and showing, even in ranking the countries in terms of fragility. So you look at the issues of gender, you look at the issue of climate change, you look at the issues of environment, you look at the issues of economic sustainability and all those things. So this is what also, as peace building architecture, trying to see that we have a house. The house is there, is built. But then how do you harmonize what is in the house? How do you rehabilitate what is broken without pulling down the house? So what we see from the report is what is needed to be able to rehabilitate and bring harmony in the house. So this one, it is very timely, because I think the Secretary General has not finalized their report to the General Assembly. So I find that is quite timely. But two, in terms of inclusivity, because this is what I see was being repeated in the report, because this, in our efforts, in our work, we find that when we talk of inclusivity, is to acknowledge the fact that there are resources that exist within society themselves. Even these countries that are called fragile, I mean, there is so much that can be built upon and be able to overcome that fragility there. So this is, we wanted to show so that UN, United Nations, is not the only actor on the ground, which is part of that. There are so many actors, including, which I have not seen in the report, that how do you bring the private sector in this whole equation of underscoring the nexus between it, because we seem like the private sector, and where this is also whether we have long-term investments, it is the driver. It's a driver of investment. It's a driver of, so which needed to be really also highlighted and underlined. And this is also in our work, we decided that we should bring out the private sector to be part of this conversation. The business group to be part of this conversation. The diplomats, of course, we know we have been playing a big role, but how do you bring these other actors who are very important? We have also seen that the need for placing great value on local expertise and knowledge and advancing investment in national capitals. I keep on repeating this because this is where I think where the solution lies. The solution lies to build on those existing capacity, upscaling it, but also using even the traditional knowledge to be able to overcome some of the critical issues that define these fragile countries. So I must say, we also been able to see, and which is on the report, the spillover effects of issues of displacement, internal displacement, as part and parcel of, if at all you are addressing the issues of development, you are addressing issues of peace building. Of course, the internal displacement is what continuously and on almost permanent basis define these countries. So how do we deal with this internal displacement? Internal displacement, of course, also the refugees. This is why also the Secretary General formed another panel on internal displacement. So trying to find lasting solution. But I've seen in the report, I think they could get something which is very instructive on addressing this issue of displacement as a permanent criteria of this fragility. And finally, I say that from the report, I like the finding that while poverty and income are associated with fragility, not all fragile contexts are low income. As 66% of the population of fragile contexts lives in middle income economies. This includes Tanzania, which has just recently graduated as a middle income. I don't know whether low or higher, but I can see it's still on the chart of fragility together with Gambia and the others. So I think some of these things that it is dynamic. There's no static. It's not like a static condition. And this is what I think could also continue as with, of course, the good thing is OECD is good at always working on these reports and depending on what is happening. But finally, to Director Moderator, I wanted to thank you for correcting me because ahead on is 3 billion. It is 60.3 billion US dollars that go to fragile context. So this is why some of the countries, they don't want to leave the fragility status. There's so much money going on, but also they're still at the same time stigmatized by being fragile states. So thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Ambassador. And I think these were all critical points to highlight. I'd like to pose one final question to Director Moreira da Silva. We've heard a lot today about partnerships, inclusivity, capacity building. When we think of development support for these areas, is there one area of the report that stands out to you that we should emphasize in closing?
Thank you, Zura. I'll be very brief before we hear from our Deputy Secretary General in the closing. First, let me thank all the kind words of appreciation about this report. I would like to channel this to my team, Paloma, Cyprian, Jonathan and all colleagues that have been involved in the production of this report. Second, it was emphasized namely by Ambassador Mulamula, the circumstance that we still focus definitely on the multidimensional component of fragility and on the prevention agenda. That's why we think that based on what we have learned from this long experience in the States of Fragility reports, but also with the recent experience with the COVID-19, bringing this States of Fragility to the next stage would depend very much from our capacity to focus on the importance of support for human capital. So if you are asking me what we can bring in the next edition, I would say that our work on human capital would be very important. The pandemic has had an incredible impact on education in fragile context. We all know that several children were out of school for a long period. Based on the data from UNESCO, we had 384 million children still out of the school in mid-July. We know what happens, especially with girls. We know that once they are out of school in many developing countries, it's very often difficult for girls in particular to return. That's why I think that having a focus on human capital would be important. We already discussed with my team that this will be definitely part of our new focus for 21 for the State of Fragility 2021. Thank you.
Thank you so much, George. And I also want to extend my thanks to you for the opportunity to join this rollout and to our 4 just incredibly insightful panelists. I would just reiterate in closing, in my role leading a global network of non-governmental private sector organizations working to sustain peace, our commitment to support this effort. And you know, my 3 takeaways from all of the important points made today are really the gravity, but also the moment to be seized in the current context to build on the findings of this report. Second, a striking alignment among OECD, the DAC, UN sustaining peace agenda in 2030, the G7 plus recommendations that we've had for many years, but also the US, you know, an emerging bipartisan consensus with initiatives like the Global Fragility Act. I think we all, civil society, governments, intergovernmental actors, and most importantly, the final point, we need to really mobilize that support for local leadership, for inclusive, people-centered application of the Nexus. And again, I think this report just presents a tremendous body of evidence, but also an impetus to move that forward. So thank you.
Thank you, Ezra. Finally, to finish, I'd like to call on Jeffrey Schlagenhoff, Deputy Secretary General at the OECD.
Thank you very much. Let me apologize if my video's bad. It's not the technology, it's me. I just am not very photogenic to do these things. But as we've heard today, the people that are most severely affected by fragility, those whose lives are most adversely affected by violence, conflict, inequality, disasters, and political turmoil, are those living in fragile contexts. They face the biggest risk of being left behind as the world strives to fulfill the Sustainable Development Goals, and they are among the hardest hit by the multidimensional shock of COVID-19. The COVID-19 pandemic has made it clear that we cannot tackle interconnected challenges such as infectious disease, violent conflict, and the impact of climate change alone or in isolation from each other. Fragility is also a local and global problem, and it deserves local and global solutions. We have a joint responsibility to make sure every country, community, and person benefits from the sources of stability and resilience needed to safeguard the peace and development. As Timor-Leste has shown, progress is possible, but it takes time and sustained commitment. This reminds me of something I've said over my career. If it's important, it's not easy. It takes hard work and takes commitment to achieve your objective. The convergence of current crises demand a strong international response on fragility. Without it, the 2030 agenda will not be achieved and the decade of action will fail. It is therefore encouraging to see that the members of the DAC have jointly committed to strive to protect official development assistance budgets, as well as encourage other financial flows to support governments and communities in partner countries in their efforts to support a sustainable global recovery. And here's why I want to take just a brief moment to depart from my prepared remarks to just acknowledge the outstanding leadership in this context of George as head of the DC Directorate and Susanna Moorhead as our DAC chair, at having really worked overtime, if you will, to bring people together behind an important agenda. It's encouraging to see members of the DAC and multilateral organizations adopting and implementing strategies and initiatives aimed to improve development cooperation in fragile contexts, such as my own country's U.S. Global Fragility Act, Belgium's Fragility Resilience Assessment Management Exercise, and the World Bank Group's Strategy for Fragility, Conflict, and Violence. The example of Timor-Leste shows that these initiatives do indeed matter. We need to question whether these initiatives and commitments are enough. As States of Fragility 2020 highlights, we need cooperation at different levels to progress on fragility and build resilience around the world, from global cooperation and governance at the highest level to cooperation among international and local actors in fragile contexts. The DAC recommendation on the humanitarian development peace nexus needs to be at the center of the global response to issues of fragility. The DAC recommendation underlines that this cooperation and coordinations needs to incorporate actors from all pillars of engagement, be they humanitarians or development agencies, diplomats or military. As the number of people in need of humanitarian assistance is rising and crises are increasingly protracted, we need to do more to not only meet needs, but also to end them. I'd like to thank the ambassador for her comment on engaging people. I think one of the things here is throughout these countries and localities where we have these fragile contexts going on, we need to engage the young people and encourage them to understand that they can be the source of finding solutions and resolutions to intractable problems that people my age have failed to address and deal with over many, many decades, years, or even centuries in many cases. We're at a turning point. States of Fragility 2020 makes it clear that if the current trajectories continue until 2030, we will leave more people and communities in fragile contexts behind. We'll have Susanna referenced taking a gigantic step backwards, and that's something that we cannot afford to do. 1 year into the decade of action, we must again renew our commitment to sustainable development and sustaining peace. The OECD will continue to champion the need for international and multilateral cooperation to tackle the joint challenges we face together and will face in the future. We will continue to work with our members to build evidence and knowledge needed to overcome the COVID-19 pandemic, address fragility, and build back better, to make sure no country, region, context, or community is forgotten as the world strives to get back on its feet. And as a last note, as George and Suzanne have said, it's my personal view that, when George Marshall gave his speech at Harvard University, he opened it by talking about the serious situation that the world is in. We're in a very similar situation. This is going to take all of us pulling together and demonstrating a psychological and financial and moral commitment to work together to build back better going forward. And so I just want to encourage all of you to keep track of our OECD publications, our States of Fragility online platform, and events that we're going to be holding on this issue over the coming months as we carry this discussion forward. This is one of those things that it just isn't an academic exercise. It's an important exercise in defining the future of the world. So thank you very much for the opportunity to join.